Some stories remind us that true heroes still walk among us, wearing different uniforms, but carrying the same timeless values of honor and courage. This is one such story. Before we begin this incredible true story, take a moment to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss our daily doses of inspiration that prove humanity's greatest moments often come from unexpected places. The morning sun cast long shadows across Buckingham Palace's ancient stones, its golden rays catching the polished buttons of the Royal Guard's uniforms. Tourist crowds gathered as they did every day, their excited chatter and camera clicks creating a familiar symphony of curiosity and wonder. Among the proud figures standing watch was David Wilson, his red uniform pristine, his posture perfect. At 28, David had already served in the military before earning his place among the elite royal guards. Now, he stood as still as the palace walls themselves, his eyes scanning the grounds with practiced precision. To tourists, he might have seemed like just another part of the historic scenery, but beneath his ceremonial exterior beat the heart of a soldier who noticed everything. Every suspicious movement, every potential threat to the peace he was sworn to protect. That peaceful spring morning seemed like any other. Children pointed at his tall bearskin hat, tourists posed for photos, and tour guides recited well-worn facts about palace history. David maintained his stoic expression, though he occasionally allowed himself a hidden smile at the more amusing tourist comments. "Look, Mommy, he's like a statue!" a little girl exclaimed, waving at him. David kept his eyes forward, but he caught glimpses of the daily life flowing around him. The elderly couple sharing a bench near the palace gates, the local shop owners opening their stores, the usual mix of visitors from around the world, their accents blending into a familiar hum. Among the regular faces he recognized was Robert "Bob" Miller, a 96-year-old World War II veteran who often visited the palace grounds. David had noticed him several times before, always impeccably dressed, his war medals proudly displayed on his navy blue blazer. Though they'd never spoken, David felt a natural respect for the elderly soldier who carried himself with such quiet dignity. That morning, Bob sat on his usual bench, his wooden cane resting beside him. He seemed to find peace in watching the changing of the guard, perhaps remembering his own days of service. David understood that connection to duty and tradition. It was something that transcended generations of soldiers. What David didn't know was that this ordinary morning was about to transform into something far more challenging. His training had prepared him for various threats to the palace, but today would test more than just protocol. It would challenge his very understanding of duty itself. Near the palace gates, a group of 4 men caught David's attention. They didn't fit the usual tourist profile. Jake Cooper, their leader, though David didn't know his name yet, had a predatory way of scanning the crowd. His associates, Sean Murphy, Chris Parker, and Mark Stevens, spread out in a pattern that raised David's internal alerts. These men weren't here to admire history. Their eyes carried a different purpose, one that set off warning signals. In David's mind, years of military and guard training had taught him to trust these instincts. He noticed how they lingered near the gates, their gazes repeatedly returning to various visitors. Were they sizing up potential targets, planning something? David maintained his ceremonial stillness, but his senses heightened, cataloging every detail. His fellow guard, Michael Bennett, standing at the opposite post, had noticed too. They'd worked together long enough to read each other's subtle signals. A barely perceptible shift in Michael's posture told David he wasn't alone in his concerns. The men's attention soon fixed on Bob Miller, who remained peacefully unaware on his bench. David watched as Jake Cooper nudged his companions, gesturing toward the elderly veteran with a smirk that made David's jaw clench beneath his stoic expression. Captain Emma Harrison, their superior officer, passed behind David during her routine inspection. In any other situation, he might have voiced his concerns, but protocol required absolute stillness and silence unless there was immediate danger. For now, all he could do was watch and wait. The morning crowd continued to mill about, unaware of the tension building in David's mind. Tour guide Sarah Matthews led another group past his post, her cheerful voice describing the palace's history. "And these guards," she was saying, "represent centuries of tradition and discipline." If only she knew how much discipline it took for David to maintain his post right now. Every instinct told him something was wrong, yet he had to wait, observe, and follow protocol. His eyes tracked Jake Cooper's group as they began moving closer to Bob's bench, their casual manner betraying darker intentions to his trained eye. The palace groundskeeper Peter Collins was trimming nearby bushes, his presence providing some comfort. At least Bob wasn't completely isolated. But David knew from experience how quickly situations could change, how swiftly peaceful scenes could transform into dangerous ones. The sun climbed higher in the sky, tourists came and went, and David stood his watch. But this was no longer just another morning at Buckingham Palace. This was the calm before a storm, and David Wilson, Royal Guard and former soldier, was about to face a test of honor that no training manual could have prepared him for. If this story has captured your attention, make sure to subscribe and join our community of inspiration seekers. Together, we'll explore more remarkable tales of courage, honor, and the unexpected heroes who walk among us. As the morning wore on at Buckingham Palace, the line between duty and moral obligation was about to blur for one dedicated royal guard. David Wilson's trained eye hadn't left Jake Cooper's group since they first caught his attention. 15 years of military and guard service had taught him to read people, to spot the subtle signs that separated tourists from troublemakers. These men were definitely the latter. Through the corner of his eye, David watched as Jake Cooper made his first move. The group's leader, wearing a leather jacket despite the warm spring day, casually strolled closer to Bob Miller's bench. His three companions spread out in a practiced formation that reminded David of wolves circling prey. Sean Murphy, the most aggressive-looking of the group, positioned himself near a souvenir stand, pretending to browse postcards while keeping the elderly veteran in his sights. Chris Parker, their designated lookout, leaned against a lamppost, his eyes constantly scanning for security or police. Mark Stevens, the largest of the four, lingered near the path that led to the palace gates, effectively blocking one potential escape route. Bob Miller remained absorbed in watching the palace activities, occasionally adjusting his medals with aged but careful fingers. David had noticed over his months of service that the old veteran had a habit of touching each medal in sequence, as if remembering the moments they represented. Today, he wore 6 medals, each one gleaming in the late morning sun. Tourist guide Sarah Matthews passed by again with a new group, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "The palace has witnessed countless historic moments," she was saying, unaware of the potential history about to unfold. A few tourists in her group paused to photograph Bob, attracted by his distinguished appearance and impressive medals. That's when David noticed Jake Cooper's expression change. The man's eyes narrowed at the attention Bob was receiving, his fingers flexing at his sides. David had seen that look before during his military service, the look of someone about to cause trouble. "Lovely medals you've got there, old-timer," Jake called out, his voice carrying a mock friendliness that set David's teeth on edge. Bob looked up, startled from his peaceful contemplation. "Oh, thank you," he replied politely, his voice carrying the gentle tremor of age but maintaining its dignity. Jake moved closer, his shadow falling across Bob's bench. "Must be worth something, eh? All that gold and silver?" The implied threat in his tone was clear to David, though tourists continued to mill about, oblivious to the brewing confrontation. David's fellow guard, Michael Bennett, shifted almost imperceptibly at his post. They'd worked together long enough to read each other's signals. Michael had picked up on the situation too, but like David, he was bound by strict protocols about leaving their posts. Bob Miller's posture stiffened slightly, his aged hands gripping his cane a bit tighter. "These medals aren't about monetary value, young man," he said firmly. "They represent service and sacrifice." His voice carried a quiet strength that made David's chest tighten with respect. Jake Cooper's smirk widened. He gestured to his companions, who began closing their loose circle around the bench. "Service and sacrifice, eh?" he mocked. "Tell us about it, Gramps. Must have been exciting playing soldier back in the day." Several tourists paused, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Palace groundskeeper Peter Collins had stopped his work nearby, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. David noticed him reaching slowly for his radio, ready to call security if needed. Bob Miller rose carefully to his feet, his movements deliberate and dignified despite his age. At 96, he stood shorter than his probable wartime height, but his bearing remained military straight.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"I'd prefer to enjoy my morning in peace," he said, gathering his cane. Sean Murphy stepped closer, intentionally blocking Bob's path. "Aw, don't leave yet, old-timer. We're interested in your little collection." His hand reached toward one of the medals, not quite touching it, but close enough to make Bob flinch back slightly. David felt his muscles tense beneath his ceremonial uniform. The temperature seemed to drop despite the spring sunshine. Tourists were definitely noticing. Now, some shooting concerned glances toward the palace guards. A woman with a young daughter hurried past, pulling her child close. Through it all, David maintained his required stillness, but his mind raced through scenarios and regulations. Royal guards weren't supposed to intervene in civilian matters unless there was a direct threat to the palace or its official visitors. Yet everything in his training, both military and guard, screamed at him to protect a vulnerable veteran from these predators. Captain Emma Harrison was due for another inspection round soon. David silently willed her to appear, to notice the situation developing right in front of the palace. But for now, he could only watch as the tension escalated. "Nice blazer too," Jake Cooper commented, reaching out to finger the fabric of Bob's jacket. "Bet it's quality stuff like they used to make." His touch wasn't quite a grab, not yet violent enough to justify intervention, but the threat was clear. Bob Miller's voice remained steady, though David detected a slight tremor in his hand as he gripped his cane. "Young man," the veteran said, "these medals and this uniform represent years of fighting against bullies. I may be old, but I haven't forgotten what they stand for." The courage in those words made David's chest swell with pride, even as his concern deepened. Jake Cooper's face darkened at the implied comparison to a bully. His fingers closed more firmly on Bob's jacket sleeve. "Fighting bullies, were you?" Jake sneered. "Well, times have changed, old man. Nobody cares about ancient history anymore." His three companions moved closer, their body language becoming more threatening. David noticed other changes too. Tourist guide Sarah Matthews had stopped her group at a safe distance, speaking quietly into a radio of her own. Local shop owner Mary Sullivan stood in her doorway across the street, phone in hand, clearly ready to call for help if needed. The regular morning crowds were thinning around the confrontation, creating a visible bubble of space around Bob's bench. It was the kind of space that preceded violence, and David knew it all too well from his military days. Captain Harrison's voice crackled on David's earpiece, performing routine guard checks. She was still on the other side of the palace, too. Far to see what was unfolding here. David had to make a decision soon, but protocol held him rigid at his post. Bob Miller stood his ground, surrounded but unbroken. His next words carried across the tense space with surprising strength. "These medals survived the war, young man. They'll survive whatever you're planning too. Jake Cooper's face contorted with anger at the old man's continued defiance. He exchanged quick glances with his companions, some silent signal passing between them. David recognized it as the moment when harassment was about to escalate into something much worse. The next few moments would test not just a Royal Guard's training, but the very meaning of duty itself. As David Wilson stood at his post, watching this confrontation unfold, he knew that sometimes the hardest battles are fought between protocol and conscience. As tension mounted outside Buckingham Palace, the thin line between duty and moral obligation was about to snap. The spring morning had lost its peaceful charm. Jake Cooper's grip on Bob Miller's jacket sleeve tightened, his knuckles whitening with barely contained aggression. "Ancient history," he spat, giving the fabric a sharp tug that made the elderly veteran stumble slightly. David Wilson's jaw clenched beneath his stoic expression. From his post, he could see every detail of the unfolding confrontation. The way Sean Murphy's hand kept dipping into his jacket pocket, suggesting a concealed weapon. The calculating looks Chris Parker shot toward the palace security cameras. The way Mark Stevens had gradually positioned himself to block the view from nearby tourists. Bob Miller regained his balance, his cane scraping against the courtyard. Stones. Despite his age, he squared his shoulders, facing Jake with remarkable composure. "Young man," he said, his voice carrying across the tense space, "I've faced worse than you in my time." Jake's face darkened. "Have you now?" He released Bob's sleeve with a sharp push, causing the veteran to step backward. "Let's hear about it then, hero. Tell us how tough you were back in the day." Several tourists had stopped completely now, phones raised to record the confrontation. David noticed Sarah Matthews, the tour guide, urgently speaking into her radio again. Palace groundskeeper Peter Collins had moved closer, rake in hand, but he was too far to intervene quickly if things escalated. "Those medals," Sean Murphy cut in, reaching toward Bob's chest. "Tell us what they're for. Must be quite the story." His tone dripped with mockery, but his eyes held something darker, greed mixed with cruel intention. Bob straightened his jacket, one hand protectively, covering his medals. "This one," he said, touching the largest medal, "was for the Battle of Normandy. But I doubt you're really interested in history lessons." "Normandy?" Mark Stevens laughed harshly. "That's ancient news, old-timer. Today's world works differently." He stepped closer, his bulk casting a shadow over Bob's smaller frame. "These days, it's about taking what you want." David's training screamed at him to intervene, every muscle in his body tensed against the rigid posture required by his duty. He could see his fellow guard, Michael Bennett, experiencing the same internal struggle at his post. Captain Emma Harrison's voice crackled over their earpieces, still conducting routine checks on the far side of the palace. "Guard rotation in 15 minutes, she announced, unaware of the situation unfolding at the gates. Jake Cooper circled Bob slowly, like a predator sizing up prey. "Nice story about Normandy," he sneered, "but I'm more interested in what these pretty decorations are worth. Must be solid gold, some of them." "They're not for sale," Bob replied firmly, though David noticed his hands trembling slightly. "Their value isn't in money." Sean Murphy barked out a laugh. "Everything's for sale, Gramps. Question is whether you're giving them up easy or hard way." He made another grab for one of the medals, this time managing to touch it before Bob could step back. The elderly veteran's face flushed with anger and hurt. "These medals represent sacrifice." His voice rose slightly, carrying hints of both fury and fear. "Men died earning these. Good men. Brave men." "Well," Jake drawled, exchanging meaningful looks with his companions. Maybe it's time they had new owners, ones who understand their real value. Tourist guide Sarah Matthews had managed to move her group away from the confrontation, but she remained nearby, her face tight with concern. Local shop owner Mary Sullivan had fully emerged from her store, phone clearly connected to emergency services. Chris Parker noticed the growing attention. "Boss," he muttered to Jake, "we're drawing crowds." His eyes darted nervously toward David and the other palace guards. Those guards might get involved. Jake smirked, glancing dismissively at David's rigid form. "They're just decoration. Can't move unless the palace is under attack. Isn't that right, toy soldier?" He raised his voice at the last part, clearly trying to provoke a response. David maintained his station pose, but his mind raced through regulations and protocols. The rules about intervention were clear. Guards could only break formation if there was a direct threat to the palace or its official visitors. But surely there had to be exceptions for preventing obvious crimes. Bob Miller's voice cut through David's thoughts. "I wore this uniform," the veteran said, gesturing to his blazer. "When men like you tried to take over Europe, we stopped them then. Someone will stop you now." The courage in those words hung in the air, but Jake's response was quick and vicious. He grabbed Bob's jacket lapel, jerking the old man forward. "Listen here, you ancient fossil." The sudden movement caused one of Bob's medals to tear loose, clattering to the courtyard stones. The sound seemed to echo in David's ears, like a gunshot shattering the last remnants of palace decorum. Bob's face went pale, his eyes fixed on the fallen medal. It was the Normandy one, the one that represented his greatest sacrifice. Jake, Cooper's boot, moved toward it, threatening to step on the precious decoration. The gathering crowd held its collective breath. Even the other tourists who had been snapping photos lowered their cameras, sensing they were witnessing something more significant than a typical palace incident. David felt something shift inside him. The strict rules and protocols that had governed his service suddenly seemed to pale against the greater duty he was witnessing being violated. Here was a decorated veteran, a man who had fought actual Nazis, being harassed and robbed in broad daylight in front of Buckingham Palace. Through his earpiece, he could hear Captain Harrison approaching his section for inspection. In mere minutes, she would round the corner and see this situation. But David knew that minutes could be too long. He had watched enough violence unfold during his military service to recognize when a situation was about to explode. Jake bent down slowly, his fingers reaching for the fallen medal. "Looks like it's already coming apart," he taunted. "Might as well take the rest too, save them from falling off." Bob Miller tried to step forward to retrieve his medal, but Mark Stevens blocked his path. The elderly veteran's dignity remained intact, but David could see fear creeping into his eyes, not fear for himself, but for the precious symbols of his service and sacrifice. The weight of duty pressed down on David Wilson's shoulders like a physical force. The fallen medal lay on the courtyard stones, its gold surface catching the late morning sun. In his 8 years as a royal guard, he had never faced such a clear moral challenge to protocol. Jake Cooper's boot hovered near the precious medal, his intent clear in the cruel twist of his smile. "What's it gonna be, old-timer?" he taunted. "Bob Miller, hand over the rest quietly, or do we do this the hard way?" Time seemed to slow as David processed every detail of the scene. The fear and dignity warring in Bob Miller's aged face. The predatory stance of Mark Stevens blocking the veteran's path. The calculating looks Sean Murphy kept throwing toward potential escape routes. The way Chris Parker nervously eyed the palace security cameras. Through his earpiece, David could hear Captain Emma Harrison's footsteps approaching on her inspection. "Round. Section 3, status check." Her voice crackled, professional and unaware of the crisis unfolding at the gates. Tourist guide Sarah Matthews had managed to position herself near a palace emergency call button, her hand hovering close but not touching it yet. Local shop owner Mary Sullivan was still on her phone across the street, clearly describing the situation to emergency services, but police response times to the palace area were typically slow for non-terror threats. They assumed the guards had everything under control. Bob Miller's voice cut through the tension, quiet but firm. "Those medals stayed with me through war, young man. They'll stay with me now." Despite his brave words, his hand trembled slightly on his cane as Jake Cooper took another menacing step forward. David's mind raced through his training. Royal guards were bound by strict protocols about leaving their posts. The rules existed for good reasons: maintaining security, preserving the dignity of the palace, ensuring clear chains of command. Breaking those rules meant possible suspension, even dismissal from service. But as he watched Jake Cooper bend down toward the fallen Normandy medal, another set of rules surfaced in David's memory. Not the written regulations of palace guard duty, but the deeper codes he'd learned in military service. Never leave a comrade behind. Protect those who cannot protect themselves. Honor the sacrifices of those who served before you. "Look at that," Jake sneered, his fingers inches from the medal. "Real gold, just like I thought. Wonder what the whole set's worth." He glanced up at Bob, malice gleaming in his eyes. "Probably more than you need at your age, right?" Bob Miller stood as straight as his 96 years would allow, his military bearing evident despite his age. "Those medals represent the lives of my friends," he said, each word clear and deliberate. "Men who never came home. You want to rob their memory too." The crowd of tourists had grown larger, many filming the confrontation on their phones. David could hear their murmurs of concern, their uncertainty about whether to intervene. Some looked pleadingly toward him and the other guards, clearly expecting them to take action. Michael Bennett, at his post across the way, caught David's eye for a split second. In that brief glance, David saw his own internal struggle reflected. They both knew what protocol demanded, and they both knew what honor required. Sean Murphy moved suddenly, grabbing Bob's arm. "Enough chat, old man. Time to—" The veteran's pained gasp as Murphy twisted his arm was soft, almost inaudible. But to David Wilson, it sounded like a thunderclap. In that moment, everything became crystal clear. He thought of his grandfather, another World War II veteran who had passed away last year. How proud he had been of his service. How carefully he had preserved his own medals. What would he think of his grandson standing rigid while another veteran was robbed of his honors in broad daylight? Captain Harrison was just around the corner now. In 30 seconds, she would see everything. But in 30 seconds, that Normandy medal might be gone, tucked into Jake Cooper's pocket, along with the dignity and memories it represented. David remembered the oath he'd taken when joining the Royal Guards, to protect and serve, to uphold the honor of the palace. But what was the palace meant to represent, if not the very values men like Bob Miller had fought to preserve? The decision crystallized in his mind with sudden clarity. Some rules existed to be followed, others existed to be transcended when duty called for something higher. Jake Cooper's fingers closed around the fallen medal. "First one's free," he smirked, starting to straighten up. "Now for the rest." David Wilson moved. The gasps from the crowd were audible as his boots left their appointed spot for the first time that day. Fellow guard Michael Bennett's eyes widened, but he gave an almost imperceptible nod of approval. "Step away from the medal." David's voice carried the authority of both his current role and his military past. The words rang across the courtyard, silencing the tourist chatter. Jake Cooper froze, genuine shock replacing his arrogant sneer. He clearly hadn't expected the toy soldier to break formation. Behind him, his companions exchanged uncertain glances, their confident intimidation faltering. "This doesn't concern you," Jake said, but his voice had lost its mocking edge. He stayed crouched by the medal, caught between retreat and defiance. "I'm making it my concern." David closed the distance with measured steps, his ceremonial uniform lending extra weight to his presence. "Release the medal. Step away from Mr. Miller. Now!" Captain Harrison's footsteps stopped abruptly around the corner. David knew she was taking in the scene, her guard out of position, the confrontation in progress, the crowd watching with bated breath. His career might end in the next few minutes, but he'd never felt more certain of a decision. Bob Miller stood straighter, hope and gratitude replacing fear in his aged features. The other tourists began to move closer, their presence adding silent support to David's intervention. Sarah Matthews finally pressed the emergency call button, its soft alarm adding to the tension. Jake Cooper slowly rose, the medal still in his hand, defiance warring with uncertainty on his face. Behind him, Sean Murphy released Bob's arm, stepping back slightly. Mark Stevens shifted his weight, no longer quite so confident in his intimidating stance. David Wilson, Royal Guard and former soldier, faced the moment of truth. Everything he'd trained for, everything he believed in, had led to this decision. Sometimes he realized the greatest test of duty wasn't in following rules, it was in knowing when to rise above them. Time seemed to stand still in the palace courtyard as David Wilson faced Jake Cooper. The stolen Normandy medal glinted in Cooper's grip, a silent witness to the confrontation about to unfold. "Last warning," David said, his voice carrying the full weight of his military training. "Return the medal and step away from Mr. Miller." Jake Cooper's initial shock at the guard's intervention was wearing off, replaced by a dangerous anger. "Or what?" he challenged, closing his fist around. "The medal. You'll get in trouble leaving your post, won't you, toy soldier?" Behind David, Captain Emma Harrison's voice cut through the tension. "Guard Wilson, explain yourself immediately." David didn't turn around. He kept his eyes locked on Jake Cooper and his group, noting how Sean Murphy's hand had slipped back into his jacket pocket. Mark Stevens had shifted his weight forward, ready to move, while Chris Parker looked increasingly nervous. "Captain," David replied, voice steady, "I'm preventing the theft of military honors from a World War II veteran." The crowd of tourists had grown larger, phones recording every moment. Local shop owner Mary Sullivan emerged from her store, followed by several others who had been watching through their windows. The palace courtyard had become an amphitheater, with David and Jake Cooper at center stage. Bob Miller stood tall despite his years, eyes fixed on his Normandy medal in Cooper's grasp. "Young man," he addressed David, "don't risk your position for me. I've lost precious things before." The dignity in the elderly veteran's voice only strengthened David's resolve. "Not today, sir," he answered, never taking his eyes off Cooper. "Not these medals. Not here." Jake Cooper's face twisted, with rage at being challenged. "Big mistake," he snarled, and lunged forward, suddenly shoving Bob Miller aside while trying to sprint past David. But David Wilson hadn't spent years in military service and Royal Guard training for nothing. His movement was fluid, practiced, and precise. He caught Cooper's arm in a controlled hold, using the man's own momentum to spin him around. The medal flew from Cooper's grasp, arcing through the air. "The medal!" Bob called out, but he needn't have worried. Michael Bennett, moving from his own post now that the situation had escalated, caught it smoothly. Sean Murphy rushed forward, pulling something from his jacket, not a weapon, but a heavy chain that he swung at David's head. David ducked, maintaining his grip on Cooper while deflecting Murphy's attack with his other arm. The chain struck his ceremonial uniform's shoulder guard with a dull clang. "Stop them!" Chris Parker shouted, but his words had an unintended effect. Rather than rallying his companions, they spurred the watching crowd into action. Palace groundskeeper Peter Collins stepped forward with his rake, blocking Parker's path. Two large tourists moved to help, cutting off potential escape routes. Mark Stevens charged at David like a bull, trying to free his boss. David was forced to release Cooper to deal with the larger threat. He redirected Stephen's charge with a textbook defensive move, sending the big man stumbling into Cooper. They crashed together, sprawling on the courtyard stones. "Enough!" Captain Harrison's command cracked like a whip. "Palace security is incoming. Everyone freeze!" But Sean Murphy wasn't listening. He swung his chain again, this time catching David's arm. David accepted the hit, using the moment of connection to step inside Murphy's guard. A quick series of precise movements, and Murphy found himself face down on the ground, his own chain used to pin his arms. Jake Cooper scrambled to his feet, realizing how badly his plan had unraveled. He turned to run, but found Michael Bennett blocking his path, the rescued Normandy medal now safely tucked in the guard's pocket. "You're not going anywhere," Michael said calmly. Tourists surged forward, phones recording everything, as palace security finally arrived in force. They quickly surrounded the scene, restraining Cooper and his companions with professional efficiency. David stood at parade rest, his uniform dusty but his posture perfect, as Captain Harrison approached. Her face was unreadable as she surveyed the scene. 4 subdued attackers, an elderly veteran safely surrounded by protective tourists, and her guard who had broken every protocol in the book. "Captain," David began, but she held up a hand. "Guard Wilson," she said formally, "you left your post without authorization." She paused, looking at Bob Miller and the medal Michael Bennett was now returning to him. "And in doing so, you upheld the highest traditions of the Palace Guard." Relief washed through David, though his expression remained professional. Behind him, he could hear the crowd breaking into spontaneous applause. Bob Miller stepped forward, carefully reattaching his Normandy medal alongside its companions. His hands were steady now, his bearing proud. "Captain," he addressed Harrison, "your guard did more than protect some medals today. He showed that the values we fought for still live." Local police were arriving now, taking statements and control of the prisoners. Jake Cooper, being led away in handcuffs, shot David a venomous look. "You should have stayed at your post, soldier." "A boy," he spat. "He stayed exactly where duty required," Captain Harrison responded coolly. She turned to David. "Report to my office in 1 hour, Guard Wilson. There will still be a review of this incident." Her slight smile softened the words. "But for now, well done." Sarah Matthews, the tour guide, was already adapting her speech for her wide-eyed group. "And here we see why the Palace Guards are more than just a tourist attraction," she was saying. "They represent the living heritage of service and courage." As the excitement began to die down, David found himself face to face with Bob Miller. The elderly veteran stood straight, one hand resting on his cane, the other touching his rescued medal. "Thank you, son," Bob said quietly. Not many would risk their position to help an old man. David shook his head. "With respect, sir, you're not just an old man. You're what we all aspire to be, someone who stands up for what's right, no matter the cost." The morning sun caught the medals on Bob's chest, making them shine like beacons. Each one told a story of courage, sacrifice, and duty. Today, they had one more story to tell. The palace hallways echoed with David Wilson's measured footsteps as he approached Captain Emma Harrison's office. The hour since the confrontation had passed quickly, filled with preliminary reports and evidence documentation. His ceremonial uniform, though slightly scuffed from the fight, remained as proper as circumstances allowed. Outside the captain's office, he paused to straighten his posture. The morning's events played through his mind. The fallen medal, Bob, Miller's dignity, Jake Cooper's sneer, the flash of the chain, the surge of the crowd. Every moment had led him to this reckoning. "Enter," Captain Harrison's voice responded to his knock. She sat behind her desk, several forms laid out before her expression carefully neutral. Guard Supervisor Richard Thompson stood to one side, while Palace Security Chief William Crawford occupied a chair in the corner. "Guard Wilson reporting as ordered, ma'am," David said, standing at attention. At ease, Harrison replied, studying him thoughtfully. You've caused quite a stir this morning, Wilson. Breaking formation, engaging with civilians, initiating physical conflict on palace grounds. She paused, shuffling through the papers. The protocol violations alone fill 3 pages. David remained silent, eyes forward. Through the office window, he could see tourists still gathered in the courtyard, many discussing the morning's excitement. Bob Miller had left earlier, escorted home by palace security to ensure no further incidents. However, Harrison continued, we also have statements from 27 witnesses, all praising your intervention. The palace switchboard is receiving calls supporting your actions. Social media is already calling you the guardian angel of the palace. Her lip twitched slightly. It seems you've become something of a celebrity. Security Chief Crawford cleared his throat. The press office is dealing with multiple media inquiries. They want interviews, background information, human interest angles. I didn't act for attention, sir, David said quietly. No, Harrison agreed. You acted to protect a veteran from theft and assault. The question is, what do we do about it? Supervisor Thompson stepped forward. The rules about breaking formation exist for good reasons. If every guard started making individual decisions about when to intervene, we'd have chaos. True, Harrison nodded, but rules without judgment become tyranny. Wilson, walk us through your decision process. David took a careful breath. I observed 4 individuals displaying predatory behavior. They identified a vulnerable target, Mr. Miller, and staged a coordinated harassment. When they escalated to physical contact and theft of military honors, I determined that immediate intervention was necessary. You could have radioed for regular security, Thompson pointed out. Response time would have been 3 to 4 minutes minimum, David countered respectfully. By then, the medals would have been gone, and Mr. Miller might have been injured resisting. Crawford nodded slowly. The local police confirmed that Cooper's group has a history. They're suspected in several attacks on elderly veterans, specifically targeting military medals for black market sale. This information hit David hard. The thought of multiple veterans being robbed of their honors made his jaw clench. Harrison noticed his reaction. That matters to you, doesn't it, Wilson? She asked. Yes, ma'am. Those medals represent sacrifice, courage, history. Each one tells a story of service. Allowing them to be stolen and sold would be... He paused, choosing his words carefully. A disgrace to everything we stand for. Harrison leaned back in her chair, exchanging glances with Crawford and Thompson. Tell me about your military service, Wilson, before joining the Palace Guard. 8 years, ma'am. 2 tours. I served with men and women who never came home. Others who brought back medals earned with blood and courage. His voice remained steady, but emotion ran beneath the words. When I saw that Normandy medal hit the ground, when I heard Mr. Miller talk about the friends he lost, protocol seemed less important than principle. A long moment of silence followed. Thompson shuffled uncomfortably, while Crawford studied some notes on his phone. Finally, Harrison spoke again. The Palace Guard is a symbol, she said slowly. We represent tradition, discipline, and unwavering duty. But symbols must mean something real, or they become mere decoration. She stood, walking to the window. Well, what happened this morning is already public. The videos are spreading. People are watching, commenting, sharing their views on what a palace guard should be. David waited, sensing there was more to come. Harrison turned back to face him. Some will say you were wrong to break protocol. Others will call you a hero. The truth, as usual, lies somewhere in between. She picked up a document from her desk. This is a formal reprimand for breaking formation without direct authorization. It will go in your file. David accepted the paper with a crisp, "Yes, ma'am." This, she continued, lifting another document, is a commendation for protecting a member of the public from criminal assault, upholding the honor of military service, and demonstrating exceptional judgment under pressure. It will also go in your file. Surprise flickered across David's face before he controlled it. Harrison allowed herself a small smile. The palace guard must evolve while maintaining its traditions. Your actions this morning, while technically against protocol, demonstrated the very values we're meant to uphold. Courage, protection of the vulnerable, respect for service and sacrifice. Security Chief Crawford stood. The media attention provides an opportunity. We can use this incident to remind people that palace guards are more than tourist attractions. You showed that the guards' dedication to duty goes beyond standing still and looking decorative. There will be changes to the protocols, Thompson added. Clear guidelines for intervention in similar situations. You've highlighted a gap in our procedures, Wilson. Harrison handed David the commendation. You'll resume regular duties tomorrow. There will be additional training for all guards on civilian intervention protocols. And, she allowed herself, another slight smile. You should expect some extra attention from tourists for a while. I understand, ma'am. Thank you. One more thing, Harrison said as David turned to leave. Mr. Miller called while you were preparing your report. He's requested to meet with you again, properly this time. Something about wanting to share some history with someone who understands its value. David felt a surge of pride and humility. I'd be honored, ma'am. Good. Dismissed, Guard Wilson. And... She paused as he reached the door. Well done. Truly. As David left the office, he passed fellow guard Michael Bennett in the hallway. They exchanged silent nods of respect. The morning's events had changed something fundamental, not just for David, but for the entire guard. Outside, the spring sun still shone on the palace stones. Tourists still took photos. Guards still stood their posts. But now there was a deeper understanding of what those posts meant. Not just following rules, but upholding the values those rules were meant to protect. The evening sun cast long shadows across the palace grounds as David Wilson finished his shift. The day's tourists had thinned to a gentle stream, many still pausing to photograph the guard who had become an unexpected social media sensation. His inbox was filled with interview requests and messages of support, but his mind was focused on a different meeting. Bob Miller waited on his usual bench, looking more relaxed than during the morning's confrontation. His medals caught the golden light, restored to their rightful place on his jacket. As David approached in his off-duty clothes, the elderly veteran's face brightened with recognition. "Ah, there you are, son," Bob said, gesturing to the space beside him. "Seems strange, seeing you out of uniform." David sat down, noticing how Bob's cane was propped carefully within easy reach. The morning's events had left their mark on both men. "How are you feeling, sir?" "Please, call me Bob." The veteran adjusted his jacket slightly. "I'm doing well enough. Better for knowing there are still people willing to stand up for what's right." He touched the Normandy medal gently. "They told me those men had done this before, to other veterans." David nodded grimly. "The police are building a case. They've connected Cooper's group to several similar incidents. Or targeting old soldiers for their medals." Bob shook his head sadly. "In my day, we had a different word for people who preyed on the vulnerable." "The world's changed," David agreed, "but some principles haven't, shouldn't change." Bob studied him thoughtfully. "You served before joining the Palace Guard?" 8 years, 2 tours. David glanced at the palace walls, remembering. Different uniform, same values. "Tell me about it," Bob encouraged, "if you don't mind sharing." David hesitated, then began to speak. He told Bob about his unit, the men and women he'd served with, the hard decisions, the moments of clarity, the lessons learned about duty and honor. Bob listened intently, occasionally nodding in understanding that spanned generations of service. "You know," Bob said when David finished, "watching you break formation this morning reminded me of something that happened in France, 1944. He straightened slightly, his voice taking on the careful tone of someone handling precious memories. "We had strict orders about engaging with civilians, protecting our supply lines, but one day we came across a village." The story unfolded like a carefully preserved photograph coming to life. Bob described finding French villagers being harassed by retreating soldiers who were stealing their food and valuables. His commanding officer had similar orders about maintaining position, not engaging unless directly threatened. "But sometimes," Bob said, touching his medal again, "you have to see beyond the orders to the principles behind them. We were there to protect people after all. That's what all the rules and protocols were really about." David leaned forward, absorbed in the tale. "What happened? We intervened, broke formation, scattered the looters, protected the villagers." Bob smiled at the memory. "Got a proper dressing down afterward, but also a commendation. Rather like you today, I expect." "Something similar," David admitted, thinking of Captain Harrison's mixed response. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the palace grounds settle into evening calm. A few tourists still lingered, some taking discreet photos of the pair on the bench. Word had spread about the morning's events. "Those men," Bob said suddenly, his voice more serious, "Cooper and his gang, they thought these medals were just valuable trinkets to be stolen and sold." His fingers traced the outline of each decoration. "They didn't understand what they represent." "Tell me," David encouraged softly. "Tell me what they mean to you." Bob's eyes grew distant with memory. "This one," he touched the Normandy medal that had almost been stolen, "represents not just a battle, but the men I served with. Tommy Richards, who loved singing old music hall songs. James Foster, who carried pictures of his baby daughter he never got to meet. Michael O'Brien, who could make us laugh even in the darkest moments." David listened as Bob shared the stories. Behind each medal, tales of courage, sacrifice, friendship, and loss flowed between them, bridging the decades that separated their service. The evening grew darker, but neither man moved to leave. "You know what hurt most this morning?" Bob asked finally. "Not the physical roughness or the threats. It was the mockery, the way they dismissed everything these medals stand for as ancient history." "It's not ancient to those who understand," David said firmly, "those who know what service really means." "No, it's not." Bob's voice strengthened. "That's why what you did matters so much. You showed that the values these medals represent, duty, courage, protecting others, they're still alive, still worth standing up for." A palace guard walked past on evening patrol, giving David a respectful nod. News of the mornings. Events had spread through the ranks, sparking discussions about duty and protocol among the guards. "I have a favor to ask," Bob said, turning to face David directly. "These medals, these stories, they need to be preserved. Would you be willing to listen to more of them? Help me record them properly?" David felt the weight of the request. This wasn't just about listening to war stories. It was about preserving history, understanding sacrifice, carrying forward the lessons of the past. "I'd be honored," he replied. "Sincerely, good man." Bob smiled, then grew serious again. "There's something else you should know. Those men this morning. I've seen others like them hanging around my neighborhood, watching, waiting. I fear they might not be done yet." David straightened, his protective instincts rising. "Have you reported it?" "To the local police," Bob nodded. "They said they'd increase patrols, but, he shrugged. "Resources are limited, can't expect constant protection." "You have my number now," David said firmly. "Any concerns, any suspicious activity, call me immediately." Bob's expression softened with gratitude. "Thank you, son. It means a lot knowing someone understands, someone cares." As night settled over the palace grounds, the two men continued talking. Different generations, different wars, but united by common values and shared understanding of what it meant to serve something greater than themselves. Morning light streamed through the palace windows as David Wilson stood at his post, alert despite the peaceful scene. 3 days had passed since the confrontation with Jake Cooper's gang, but something felt off. The usual tourist crowds milled about, snapping photos and pointing at the guards, yet David's military instincts buzzed with warning. His fellow guard, Michael Bennett, had noticed it too. Something about the way certain people lingered too long, watching the guards with calculation rather than curiosity. They discussed it during shift change, agreeing to stay extra vigilant. Sarah Matthews, the tour guide, approached David's post with her morning group. She'd taken to pausing here longer than usual ever since the incident with Bob Miller. Today, though, her cheerful commentary faltered mid-sentence. David followed her sudden glance toward the palace gates. Two men he didn't recognize were speaking with Bob Miller. The elderly veteran had arrived for his usual morning visit, but instead of his peaceful contemplation, he was clearly uncomfortable. Even from a distance, David could read the tension in Bob's posture. "And here we have," Sarah continued professionally, but her eyes darted worriedly between David and the scene at the gates, the famous Royal Guards, whose dedication to duty extends beyond mere ceremony, as we saw recently. The men talking to Bob weren't Jake Cooper's original gang. They were still in custody. But something about their body language, the way they boxed Bob in against the gates, seemed familiar. David's muscles tensed beneath his ceremonial uniform. Captain Emma Harrison's voice came through his earpiece. "Guard Wilson, we're monitoring the situation. Palace security is on standby." The new protocols implemented after the first incident had improved response capabilities, but David wondered if they would be enough. He watched as one of the men reached toward Bob's medals, not grabbing them yet, but making his intentions clear. "Really fine collection you've got," the man's voice carried across the courtyard. "Shame about what happened to Jake. He was just admiring them, you know." Bob's voice, though shaking slightly, remained dignified. "Your friend was attempting theft and assault. The consequences are his own doing." The second man stepped closer. "See, that's not how we see it. Jake's facing serious time because some jumped-up guard couldn't mind his own business." Tourists began to notice the confrontation. Phones emerged, recording the scene. Palace groundskeeper Peter Collins moved closer with his rake, while local shop owner Mary Sullivan appeared in her doorway, already dialing her phone. "I suggest you leave," Bob said firmly, gripping his cane. "This is a public space, under guard." The first man sneered. "Guards have to stay at their posts now. New protocols, right? After what happened with Jake." He reached for Bob's medals again. "So, how about we finish what he started?" David's earpiece crackled. "Palace security 2 minutes out," Captain Harrison updated. "Hold position unless direct threat emerges." The growing crowd of tourists created a subtle pressure. Many recognized Bob from viral videos of the first incident. Some began calling out encouragement to him, while others looked expectantly toward David. "Last chance, old man," the second thug growled. "Hand them over quiet or we do this the hard way. Your choice." Bob Miller straightened to his full height, his 96 years falling away as military bearing took over. "I earned these medals, fighting real monsters," he said clearly. "You don't frighten me." The first man's face darkened. He grabbed Bob's jacket lapel, exactly as Jake Cooper had done. "Have it your way." David's decision was instant. New protocols or not, he wouldn't watch this happen again. He stepped away from his post. This time, though, he wasn't alone. Michael Bennett moved too, coordinated and purposeful. Captain Harrison's voice came through sharp and clear. "Guards authorized to intervene. Protect the civilian." The thugs froze at the sight of two royal guards approaching in formation. The crowd parted before them, phones recording every step. Sarah Matthews quickly moved her tour group back, creating space. "Release him," David commanded, his voice carrying the full authority of his position. "Step away from Mr. Miller." The men exchanged uncertain glances. They'd clearly counted on the guards being restricted by the new protocols, not realizing those same protocols now explicitly allowed intervention in cases of civilian harassment. "You're interfering with official business," the first man tried, maintaining his grip on Bob's jacket. "We're here about a legal matter with Jake Cooper." "Your only legal matters," Michael Bennett responded coldly, "are about to be assault charges and threatening behavior on palace grounds." Palace security emerged from multiple directions, well-armed and serious. The thug's confidence crumbled visibly. The first man released Bob's jacket, raising his hands in a poor attempt at innocence. "Just having a conversation," he muttered, but no one was fooled. David positioned himself beside Bob, while Michael kept the would-be attackers in sight. "Mr. Miller," David said formally, "are you all right?" "Quite all right, son," Bob replied, adjusting his jacket with dignity. "Though I admit the company was becoming rather tiresome." Security officers moved in, efficiently detaining the two men. Captain Harrison appeared, her presence commanding immediate attention. "These men," she announced clearly, ensuring the recording tourists could hear, "are now under arrest for attempted assault, harassment, and threatening behavior on palace grounds." She turned to Bob. "Mr. Miller, we'll need your statement." The crowd burst into applause. Several tourists called out support for Bob and the guards. Sarah Matthews had already woven the incident into her tour narrative, describing how palace traditions adapted to protect modern values. As the thugs were led away, one of them called back, "This isn't over. The medals, all of them, they're worth more than you know." Captain Harrison's eyes narrowed at these words. She gestured for David to join her and Bob slightly apart. From the crowd, "Mr. Miller," she said quietly, "I believe there's more to this than simple theft. 2 incidents in a week, specifically targeting your medals? Something doesn't add up." Bob nodded gravely. "I've been thinking the same. During the war, we heard rumors about certain medals, special markings that meant something to resistance networks, messages hidden in plain sight." David caught the implication. "You think your medals might have historical significance beyond their military value?" "It's possible." Bob touched the Normandy medal thoughtfully. "I never knew the full story behind some of these. They were awarded under unusual circumstances during covert operations." Harrison made a quick decision. "Guard Wilson, I'm assigning you additional duties. When not on post, you'll assist in protecting Mr. Miller and investigating these incidents." She held up a hand to forestall any response. "Consider it part of the palace's new community protection protocols." David straightened. "Understood, Captain." The crowd was dispersing now, but David noticed several suspicious individuals lingering at the edges of the courtyard. This wasn't over. Jake Cooper's gang had been part of something larger, something that saw Bob Miller's medals as more than just valuable antiques. Evening shadows lengthened across London streets as David Wilson parked his car near Bob Miller's apartment building. He'd finished his palace guard shift early, concerned by a cryptic phone call from the elderly veteran about suspicious activities around his home. The neighborhood was quiet, too quiet. David's military instincts registered the absence of the usual corner shop customers, the missing dog walkers, the still curtains in normally busy windows. Something had scared the locals inside. Frank Morris, the building manager, intercepted David at the entrance. "Thank goodness you're here," he said in a hushed voice. "There's been men watching the building all day, different ones taking turns. They're trying to be subtle, but..." He shrugged helplessly. "Is Mr. Miller safe?" David asked, already, moving toward the stairs. "He's in his flat. Called me an hour ago about noises in the hallway. I did a check but didn't see anyone." Frank wrung his hands nervously. "There's something else. Someone tried to hack the building's security system this afternoon. Cameras went down for 20 minutes. David's concern deepened. This wasn't opportunistic theft anymore. This was a coordinated operation. "Call this number," he handed Frank a card. "Ask for Captain Harrison. Tell her we need palace security at this address immediately." Taking the stairs two at a time, David reached Bob's floor. The hallway was dark, emergency lights casting odd shadows. He approached Bob's door cautiously, noting scuff marks on the floor, signs of recent activity. A muffled crash came from inside the apartment. David acted instantly, using his spare key, given to him by Bob after the second palace incident. He unlocked the door quietly. Years of military training took over as he eased it open. The apartment was dark, except for a desk lamp knocked over in the living room. 3 men in dark clothing were ransacking the place methodically. A fourth held Bob Miller in a chair. One hand pressed over the veteran's mouth. "Find those medals," a familiar voice commanded. David recognized the speaker, the same man who'd threatened Bob at the palace that morning. "They have to be here somewhere." David assessed the situation rapidly. Bob's eyes met his across the room, alert and angry, but not panicked. The veteran gave an almost imperceptible nod. "The old man's not talking," the man restraining Bob growled. "Maybe we need to be more persuasive." The leader turned, his face twisted with frustration. "Look harder. Those medals aren't just decorations. Our client says there's information hidden in them. Resistance codes, communication channels, something. About a network that never shut down after the war." David's mind raced. Bob's hints about covert operations suddenly gained new meaning. But there was no time to ponder implications. Bob was in immediate danger. Making his decision, David stepped fully into the doorway. "Step away from him. Now." The intruders spun, startled by his commanding voice. Their leader recovered, burst sneering. "The toy soldier again. Bad choice, coming here alone." "Who says I'm alone?" David replied calmly. Through his phone connected to his earpiece, palace security would be hearing everything. Captain Harrison's team was surely already en route. But these men were desperate. Instead of surrendering, they charged. The first attacker came in low, trying to tackle David. Palace guard training combined with military experience took over. David sidestepped, used the man's momentum to slam him into the wall. The second pulled a knife. David caught his wrist, twisted sharply. The blade clattered to the floor as the man howled in pain. Bob seized his moment. Despite his age, 96, years couldn't erase a soldier's instincts. He drove his elbow back into his captor's stomach, then swung his cane with surprising speed. The solid crack of wood meeting shin was followed by a yelp of pain. The leader, seeing his plan unraveling, made a desperate grab for a small box on Bob's shelf, the case containing his most precious medals. "Don't move! We'll destroy them!" "No, you won't," David said with quiet certainty. "Those medals survived Nazi Germany. They'll survive you." Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer, the leader's face contorted with rage. He hurled the medal case at David's head, using the distraction to bolt for the fire escape. David caught the case one-handed, immediately passing it to Bob. The elderly veteran cradled it protectively, while David efficiently subdued the remaining attackers. Years of training made it look almost easy, though each movement was precisely calculated. Palace security burst in moments later, led by Captain Harrison herself. The scene was already under control. 3 intruders subdued. Their leader's escape cut off by officers on the ground. "Area secure," Harrison announced crisply. Mr. Miller, are you all right? Bob straightened his jacket, dignity intact despite the chaos. Quite all right, Captain, though I believe, he glanced at his scattered belongings, it's time I explained what they were really after. Later, as police processed the scene, Bob opened the medal case carefully. David and Captain Harrison watched as he extracted the Normandy medal that had started everything. During the war, Bob began, his voice soft with memory. We weren't just fighting battles. We were part of a vast intelligence network, messages, codes, safe house locations, all hidden in plain sight, some in medals like these. He turned the medal over, pointing to tiny marks that seemed like ordinary wear and tear. Micro-engravings. When combined with markings on other veterans' medals, they formed a complete communication system. Most of those who knew died during the war or shortly after. I'm one of the last. And someone figured it out, Harrison said grimly. Started targeting veterans' medals, looking for pieces of the puzzle. Bob nodded. They think the network is still active, that these old codes could help them access something valuable. He smiled slightly. They might be right, but they'll never get their hands on these medals to find out. David looked at his former military commander. Captain, I request permission to continue protective detail for Mr. Miller. Granted, Harrison replied without hesitation. We'll also arrange secure storage for the medals at the palace when needed. Mr. Miller will have full access, of course. Bob's eyes brightened. The palace? Well, that would be fitting, full circle in a way. He touched the medals gently. These old secrets have been safe with me for over 70 years. Good to know they'll stay protected. David stood at parade. Rest, every inch the Royal Guard, despite his civilian clothes. As long as I'm standing, sir, they will be. The night's shadows softened around them, but the sense of duty and connection between the young guard and elderly veteran remained. Strong and clear. Some things were worth protecting, whether they were medals, memories, or the bonds between soldiers separated by generations but united by service. Morning light streamed through the windows of New Scotland Yard as David Wilson sat beside Bob. Miller in a conference room. Detective Inspector Lisa Chen spread photographs across the table, images of medals, veterans, and the men who had targeted them. The organization calls itself Heritage Reclamation, Lisa explained, pointing to surveillance photos. They've been operating across Europe, targeting World War II veterans' medals and memorabilia. We thought they were just high-end thieves, but thanks to Mr. Miller's information, we now understand their true motives. Captain Emma Harrison, representing Palace Security, leaned forward. How many veterans have been targeted? 17 confirmed cases in the past year, Lisa replied grimly. Most victims were too frightened to report it. They'd receive visits from collectors offering to buy their medals. If they refused, the threats would begin. Bob touched his Normandy medal thoughtfully. How many knew about the codes? The real reason behind the thefts? Most didn't, Lisa said, but your case broke the investigation wide open. Once we understood what they were looking for, patterns emerged. Every targeted veteran had served in intelligence operations, even if they didn't know the full scope of their involvement. David studied the photos carefully. Jake Cooper's gang, they were just local muscle, weren't they? Hired help? Lisa nodded. Small-time criminals recruited for deniability. The real organization is much more sophisticated. Their leader, Marcus Blackwood, is a former military intelligence officer who discovered references to the World War II communication network in classified files. She placed another photo on the table. A distinguished-looking man in his 60s, steel-gray hair and cold eyes. Blackwood became obsessed with the idea that the network never fully shut down. He believed the medals contained codes to access dormant intelligence channels, maybe even forgotten bank accounts or hidden caches. He wasn't entirely wrong, Bob admitted. The medals did contain coded information. but he misunderstood their purpose. Captain Harrison raised an eyebrow. How so? Bob carefully removed his Normandy medal, holding it under the room's bright light. The markings weren't about money or material treasures. They were about people, a rescue network that helped Jewish families and resistance fighters escape occupied territories. The codes identified safe houses, sympathetic contacts, escape routes. He traced the tiny marks on the medal's surface. Each medal held a piece of the puzzle. No single veteran knew the complete network. It was safer that way. If captured, you couldn't reveal what you didn't know. But the network's inactive now, Lisa said. Why would Blackwood's organization go to such lengths? Because some of those escape routes still exist, Bob explained. The safe houses, the hidden passages, the secret compartments in old buildings. Blackwood probably thought he could sell the information to modern criminal enterprises, people smugglers, drug traffickers, anyone wanting untraceable routes across borders. David felt a surge of pride and anger, pride in the veterans who had protected these secrets for so long, anger at those who would corrupt their legacy. How close is Blackwood to acquiring enough medals to make sense of the codes? Lisa's expression turned satisfied. He's not. Thanks to your intervention at the palace and Mr. Miller's flat, we've rolled up most of his organization. Blackwood himself was arrested this morning in Geneva. The Swiss authorities found him trying to intimidate another veteran. Captain, Harrison smiled slightly. I understand our guard's actions played a role in that arrest. Indeed, Lisa confirmed. The videos of David protecting Mr. Miller went viral. Other veterans recognized their attackers, started coming forward. The Palace incident broke the case wide open. Bob straightened in his chair. What about the other veterans' medals? The ones that were stolen? Being recovered as we speak, Lisa assured him. International police operations are raiding heritage reclamation safe houses across Europe. Most of the medals will be returned to their rightful owners or their families. David watched Bob's shoulders relax slightly at this news. The elderly veteran had carried the secret for over 7 decades, watching his comrades pass away one by one, keeping faith with their shared mission. Mr. Miller, Lisa said gently, we'll need your help documenting the code system, not the specific locations. Those can remain secret. But understanding the methodology could help us identify similar networks in other conflicts. Bob nodded, slowly. Yes, I suppose it's time, but only if David here can assist. He's proved himself worthy of the trust. David felt honored by the request. I'd be proud to help, sir. Captain Harrison cleared her throat. That brings us to another matter. The palace has been discussing ways to better protect veterans and their legacy. We're proposing a new unit within the Guard, specifically trained for community protection and heritage preservation. She turned to David. Guard Wilson, we'd like you to help develop the training protocols based on your experiences these past weeks. David sat straighter. It would be an honor, Captain. There's more, Harrison continued. Mr. Miller has agreed to serve as a civilian advisor to the unit. His experience, both from the war and recent events, would be invaluable. Bob smiled. Seems I'm not quite done serving after all. Lisa gathered her photographs, her expression becoming serious. One last thing. We found documents in Blackwood's possession, lists of other veterans he planned to target. Some of these men and women still don't know they were part of the larger network. They may need protection. They'll have it, David said firmly, exchanging glances with Captain Harrison. The Palace Guard protects more than just buildings. We protect what these veterans fought for, the values, the sacrifices, the legacy they've entrusted to us. Later that afternoon, David and Bob walked through the palace grounds together. The tourist crowds parted respectfully around them, many recognizing the veteran and guard from news reports. Quite a turn of events, Bob mused, watching a group of schoolchildren wave excitedly at them. When I woke up that first morning, I never imagined my quiet visits to the palace would lead to all this. David smiled. Sometimes duty calls in unexpected ways. Indeed it does, son. Bob touched his restored medals, now even more precious for the renewed understanding of their significance. You know, after the war, people would ask why we didn't share the code system, reveal the network. They thought we were being unnecessarily secretive. But you were protecting more than information, David understood. You were protecting the people who risked everything to help, the families who offered shelter, the communities that kept faith. Exactly. And now, thanks to you and your fellow guards, those secrets will stay protected, not hidden away in a museum or locked in an archive, but preserved through living memory and active service. They reached Bob's usual bench, now informally, known among the palace staff as the Veterans' Rest. A small plaque had appeared on it recently, though no one officially claimed responsibility for its installation. It read simply, "Dedicated to those who serve, past and present." "I've been thinking," Bob said as they sat down. "All those veterans on Blackwood's list, they're part of a story that's not quite finished. Maybe it's time they knew the full truth about their service, about how their medals connect to a larger legacy of courage and compassion." David nodded thoughtfully. The new guard unit could help with that. Not just protecting them, but helping preserve their stories, their contributions. Bob's eyes sparkled with renewed purpose. "Then we'd better get started, hadn't we? There's still work to be done, still honor to be protected." The palace grounds shimmered in the morning sunlight, transformed by rows of chairs and a red carpet, leading to a specially constructed stage. Uniformed guards stood at attention while guests filed in. Veterans, police officers, palace officials, and selected members of the press. David Wilson adjusted his dress uniform, every button gleaming, every crease perfect. Beside him, Bob Miller sat straight-backed in his chair, medals proudly displayed on his jacket. The Normandy medal that had started everything held a place of particular honor. Captain Emma Harrison approached them, her own dress uniform immaculate. "Quite a turnout," she said, surveying the gathering crowd. "The palace hasn't hosted an honor ceremony like this in years." Indeed, the audience included not just local dignitaries, but representatives from veteran organizations across Europe. Many wore their own medals, creating a tapestry of honor that spanned generations of service. Detective Inspector Lisa Chen stood near the stage, coordinating with palace security. The investigation into heritage reclamation had expanded, uncovering and protecting veterans across the continent. Today would recognize not just David and Bob, but the legacy they had helped preserve. Sarah Matthews, the tour guide who had witnessed the first confrontation, led a special group of tourists to reserved seats. Her daily palace tours now included the story of the guard who had broken protocol to protect a veteran, though few knew the full scope of what that protection had revealed. Local shop owner Mary Sullivan and building manager Frank Morris sat together, representing the community that had supported Bob through the ordeal. Other familiar faces dotted the crowd. Palace groundskeeper Peter Collins, fellow guard Michael Bennett, and many who had witnessed or assisted during the critical moments. "Guard Wilson," Captain Harrison said formally. "Are you ready?" David straightened. "Yes, ma'am." "Mr. Miller." Bob touched his Normandy medal gently. "More than ready, Captain. This old soldier has one more parade left in him." The ceremony began with traditional pomp and circumstance. A palace official detailed the events that had led to this day, though certain sensitive information about the medal codes remained classified. The audience listened intently as the story unfolded, a tale of duty, courage, and the unbreakable bonds between soldiers of different generations. "Today," the official announced, "we recognize not just individual acts of bravery, but the enduring spirit of service that connects past and present. Guard David Wilson exemplified the highest traditions of the Palace Guard, proving that true duty sometimes requires us to look beyond routine and regulation. David stood at attention as Captain Harrison approached with a special commendation. This was more than a routine award. It was the newly created Guardian of Heritage Medal, designed specifically to recognize those who protected both the physical and spiritual legacy of service. "Guard Wilson," Harrison proclaimed. "Your actions reminded us that the Palace Guard exists not just to stand watch, but to stand up for the values that make our heritage worth protecting." As she pinned the medal to his uniform, David caught Bob's eye. The elderly veteran beamed with pride, as if watching his own son being honored. In many ways, their experiences had forged a bond as strong as family. Next came Bob's recognition. He rose carefully but proudly as the official called his name. "Mr. Robert Miller, your service to this nation spans more than 7 decades. From the beaches of Normandy to the recent events at this very palace, you have demonstrated unwavering courage and dedication." The official revealed a distinctive blue box. "By royal decree, you are hereby awarded the Palace Cross for exemplary service, in recognition not just of your wartime valor, but your role in preserving vital historical heritage and protecting future generations." A collective murmur of appreciation ran through the crowd. The Palace Cross was rarely awarded to civilians, making this moment particularly significant. As Bob received his new medal, his hands steady despite his 96 years, David noticed tears in the eyes of many veterans in the audience. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, the weight of the secrets Bob had carried and protected for so long. The ceremony continued with additional recognitions. Michael Bennett received a commendation for supporting David's intervention. Captain Harrison was honored for her role in adapting palace protocols to better serve both tradition and public safety. Detective Inspector Chen accepted an award on behalf of the International Police Task Force that had brought down heritage. Reclamation. Then came the announcement that brought everything full circle. "Today, we also officially establish the Palace Heritage Protection Unit," the official declared. This new division of the Guard, under Guard Wilson's leadership and with Mr. Miller's guidance, will ensure that the legacy of service and sacrifice remains not just preserved, but protected. David and Bob exchanged glances, both remembering their conversation on the veterans' bench just weeks ago. What had begun as a simple act of protection had grown into something far more significant, a new chapter in the palace's long history of service. The ceremony concluded with a special moment that hadn't been on the official program. Veterans. In the audience, many who had learned only recently about their own medal's connection to the wartime network stood in silent salute to Bob Miller. The gesture recognized not just his physical courage, but the decades of quiet dedication that had kept their shared legacy safe. Later, as the crowds began to disperse, David and Bob found themselves back at their familiar bench. The new medals they'd received caught the sunlight, adding their shine to the historical decorations they both wore. "Quite a production," Bob mused, touching his palace cross. "Though I suspect the real work is just beginning." David nodded. The Heritage Protection Unit already has requests from veterans organizations across the country. "Seems there are many more stories to protect, more legacies to preserve. And you'll do it well," Bob said confidently. "You've proven that beyond any doubt." They sat in comfortable silence, watching tourists return to their regular patterns. Around the palace, Sarah Matthews could be heard in the distance, adding the day's ceremony to her regular tour commentary. "You know," Bob said thoughtfully, "when those men first tried to take my medals, I was afraid their story would die with me, that all the sacrifice and secrecy would be lost or twisted into something ugly." "Instead," David replied, It's given new purpose to both the past and the present. Every guard who serves in the new unit will carry forward the values your generation fought to protect. Bob smiled, the weight of decades of secrecy finally lifting from his shoulders. Different uniforms, different times, but the same spirit of service. That's what these medals really represent. Not just what we did, but what we inspire others to do. 2 months after the ceremony, David Wilson stood at his guard post, the morning sun glinting off his new Guardian of Heritage medal. The palace grounds had returned to their normal rhythms, but subtle changes marked the impact of recent events. Tourist guide Sarah Matthews now included a special stop at the Veterans Bench in her tours. Local veterans often gathered there, sharing stories with Bob Miller, who had become something of a palace fixture. The new Heritage Protection Unit operated from a dedicated office near the main gate, its presence a reminder that some traditions evolved to remain relevant. David noticed a group of schoolchildren approaching, led by their teacher. They paused nearby, pointing excitedly at his uniform and medals. Among them was a small boy clutching a photograph of his grandfather in military dress. Bob arrived for his regular morning visit, moving more easily now with a new, more comfortable cane, a gift from the palace staff. The children's eyes widened as they recognized him from news reports and social media. Their teacher smiled, encouraging them to approach respectfully. "Mr. Miller," she said warmly, "the children have been learning about service and sacrifice. Would you mind sharing a story with them?" Bob's eyes twinkled as he settled onto his bench. "Well, now, every medal tells a tale," he began, touching his decorations. "But perhaps the most important story is about a young guard who reminded us all what these medals truly stand for." David maintained his ceremonial stillness, but he listened as Bob recounted their shared adventure to the fascinated children. The elderly veteran had a gift for storytelling, weaving themes of duty, courage, and friendship into a narrative that captured young imaginations. "The palace guard didn't just protect my medals," Bob explained, gesturing to David. "He protected what they represent. The idea that standing up for what's right matters more than just following rules." The boy with the photograph raised his hand. "Like my granddad, he was brave too." "Just like your granddad," Bob agreed. "And now, thanks to the Heritage Protection Unit, we're making sure all veteran stories and honors stay safe." Captain Emma Harrison appeared, accompanied by Detective Inspector Lisa Chen. They had been working together, coordinating international efforts to protect veterans and their legacies. The heritage reclamation case had opened eyes worldwide to the importance of preserving military history. "Mr. Miller," Lisa greeted him. "We've had another success. 3 more veterans from your old network have been located in France. Their medals are intact, their stories preserved." Bob nodded with satisfaction. "Good. Every piece saved helps complete the picture." He turned back to the schoolchildren. "You see, young ones, history isn't just in books. It lives in memories, in medals, in the choices we make to protect what matters." David's shift partner, Michael Bennett, arrived for the changeover. As they executed the precise movements of their guard rotation, David noticed how tourists now watched with deeper appreciation. They weren't just seeing ceremonial pageantry, they were witnessing living tradition adapting to serve modern needs. Later, during his break, David joined Bob on his bench. The Heritage Protection Unit's office hummed with activity behind them. Veterans from across the country had been reaching out, sharing their own stories of service and sacrifice. "We've made a difference," Bob said quietly, "not just protecting medals, but helping people understand why they matter." David agreed. The unit's already handled 15 cases, different circumstances, but the same core mission, preserving honor and legacy. They watched as another tour group passed, phones recording the guards, excited whispers discussing the famous veteran and his guardian. Social media had turned their story viral, but the deeper impact went beyond likes and shares. "You know," Bob mused, "when those thugs first threatened me, I thought they could only steal my medals. Now I realize they were trying to steal something far more precious. The connection between generations, the living memory of sacrifice and service." David touched his Guardian of Heritage medal. They failed. Instead, they helped create something new, a way to protect not just the physical symbols of honor, but their meaning. Captain Harrison approached carrying a folder. "Gentlemen, we've had requests from military museums worldwide. They want to implement similar protection programs. It seems we've started something significant." Bob smiled. "Good. The more people understand what these medals truly represent, the better protected all our stories will be." A fresh group of tourists gathered nearby. Sarah Matthews began her tour introduction. "Welcome to Buckingham Palace, where ancient tradition and modern courage meet. Let me tell you a story about a royal guard who chose honor over protocol and the veteran who carried secrets worth protecting." David resumed his post, standing tall in the morning sun. His new medal caught the light, a reminder that some duties went beyond standing guard. They involved standing up for the values that made guard duty meaningful. The palace grounds filled with visitors, each drawn to the living history before them. Bob's bench became a gathering point for veterans, tourists, and schoolchildren, all sharing in the legacy of service and sacrifice. And so, the story continued, not just in medals and memories, but in the daily dedication of those who chose to protect them. Different uniforms, different times, but the same unwavering commitment to honor and duty. Thanks for joining us for this incredible true story of courage, duty, and unexpected friendship. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this tale of honor and protection touched your heart, you won't want to miss these upcoming features. Just click and discover more remarkable stories of everyday heroes making extraordinary choices. Remember to subscribe and hit that notification bell to ensure you never miss our latest inspiring tales of courage and conviction. Your support helps us continue sharing these important stories of honor, duty, and the enduring human spirit.